everyone. Welcome to the Tech Community Live event for Microsoft Intune. I'm Kara, and I'll be introducing today's session. We have Jack Pullman here talking to us about Microsoft Cloud PKI for Microsoft Intune Suite.
Hi, Kara, today.
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am okay. I don't know, it's been sunny here in the Pacific Northwest for a few days, and now it's cloudy and they're threatening rain. Imagine that, the Pacific Northwest.
I'm in the office today in New York City, and it is a little gloomy today, but that's okay.
Nice. Kara, do we want to start with a demo of Cloud PKI?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, great. Let me get my screen shared here. So for those that haven't seen it, Cloud PKI is a new Intune Suite feature that we released in February. And you can find it under Tenant Administration, Cloud PKI. And let me give a quick demo of how you create a new certificate authority. So you can see my environment currently has some certificate authorities already created, but we'll create a new one. And we'll call this one Tech Root for brevity. And so this is just the display name that you would create and see, just like any other Intune policy you would see in the console. And the first step is to pick what kind of CA do I want to create. So in this case, we're creating a new PKI tree, if you will. So we'll say we're going to create a root. We get to select a validity period. And this is what the lifetime of this root certificate authority is going to be. Generally, root certificates, it's a good idea to create them for a long validity. So we'll select 25 years. And then in key usage is a kind of an interesting one. The way we've built the product is this ultimately limits what key usages can be issued by this PKI infrastructure that we're building. So it's a good idea here to select the ones that you perceive you would ever want to use. So really common is server auth and client auth. Some other things that people often use would be smart card login, and code signing is a good future thing if that's something you perceive you would want to do, along with some of the other options in here. And we also have an option for custom. So if there's a custom object identifier, or commonly known as an OID, that's one that could be selected, and you would enter in what the object identifier is there. So those are parameters that we've selected for our root certificate authority, and now we'll actually fill in what the attributes are. So we're going to call this one TechCom for a common name. The other subject attributes are optional. You can see the asterisk there calls out which ones are required, and it is only common name. Good practice is to have a country as a 2-digit country code. So US would be a good one if that's where you are, or whatever your country code is where you live. And then also the last option here is what's our key size and algorithm that we want to use. Many people today are looking at using RSA keys that are at least 4096 or a 4K cert at minimum. And this is something we'll probably get into a little bit more, but we've developed this around best practice. So like previously, people would create a 1K or a 1024 key size. That's been deprecated some years ago, and we just don't even allow customers to create certificate authorities with that key size. So once we've got our selections there, next, here we can use scope tags. Cloud PKI falls into Intune's standard RBAC model and scope tags. So if we wanted to limit the visibility of this to a certain list of admins, we would use a scope tag to assign that there. So next, get a chance to review everything and create. And we'll give this just a second. It tells us it's off from working. And as soon as we get a notice there that it's been created, we should be able to hit refresh. And we have now created a root certificate authority. This is way faster than people in the past would have spooled up maybe a Windows server and installed the certificate authority role or ADCS. Um, this is done and live, and it's actively publishing CRLs. So and all of those things. The next step beyond this, if we wanted to use this to issue certificates to client devices, we'd create an issuing certificate authority off of this CA. And then we would go create a trusted root certificate policy we deploy to our devices, and finally a SCEP policy, or a simple certificate protocol policy that would tell devices to go enroll for their certificates. So that's kind of the basis of Cloud PKI. Cara, is there anything specific you wanted to see more about?
Um, thanks for walking us through the demo of Cloud PKI. It's really cool to be able to see that. Jack and I work very closely together on Intune Suite, so from my side, it's really cool to see the demo and like for it to be end to end. We have some questions in that have come surfaced from the website for tech community. So just a reminder for our audience, ask us anything about Microsoft Cloud PKI for the session at aka.ms, AMA, Cloud PKI, and Intune Suite. So the first question, Jack, comes from Hamid. Will Cloud PKI support multiple certificate deployments based on the different use cases? Like if we want devices with certain values defined in certs to be recognized, say X, Y, and Z, to control the access of the data from those certificate values. So yeah, Jack, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so this would honestly be a capability that's existed in Intune before Cloud PKI and continues to exist today. So if I understand the question correctly, the way I would approach this is you could definitely create multiple certificate deployment policies or SCEP policies. And on those, you can adjust the attributes that you want to use, and then you assign those to different groups of users or devices. So maybe I have one instance where I want to deploy user-based certificates with user attributes. Maybe the subject name is going to be the user's common name, and I would have a subject alternative name of probably their email address. So I could certainly create that and deploy that as a user cert to Windows, iOS, Android devices. And then alternatively, I could additionally have a device-based certificate where maybe it's the fully qualified domain name of a Windows device. And I set that as the common name, or maybe I set that as a SAN. So it's all dependent on where are you going to use these certificates and what are the requirements of that backend authentication service that you want to use. So Intune has always had that flexibility, and Cloud PKI is built on top of what we already had for deploying certificates. The real key value of Cloud PKI is the simplicity of being able to create the certificate authority and not have to have all that on-premise infrastructure.
Thanks, Jack, for the explanation there. We have another question that has surfaced from X. So how much PKI knowledge do I need to have to administer this?
Yeah, so this is always a challenging question. You saw the demo; it was very, very simple. I think we've done a really good job of simplifying how this can be done and how you deploy a certificate authority. With that, with great simplicity, always comes a great responsibility. So some of the things I know I'm concerned about with customers is that maybe they don't understand some of the needs and best practices for their organization. Kind of like I pointed out, adding the country attribute on my certificate authority. It's not a requirement, but it's a really good idea. And there may be some backend services that you'll use these certificates for authentication against that may require those attributes. So as far as creating it in Intune, very simple. You don't need to have a lot of knowledge to do it. I think the question really comes into is what are your needs and how are you going to use these certificates? They're going to be deployed. And our great questions to ask within your organization. If you're new to PKI, grab a book and read it. There's a lot of great references out there. PKI is an art form, I think, that people have built a craft and a skill around for years. The other good point that I do want to make on this topic, though, is in our mission statement here within Microsoft Intune is to manage the world's devices simply and securely. We have built Cloud PKI to go against both of those mission statements. Simply, you saw the demo, super simple to create. Securely, we've also used best practices that Microsoft has from years of experience as a leader in the certificate space, to prevent customers from creating things that would keep them less secure. One example we can't really show in the demo, but for paid customers, the private keys associated with these certificate authorities are backed in hardware security modules, or HSMs. That keeps that private key locked down and secure, and really is a good best security practice.
Thank you for the explanation there. It seems like if I were new to this, I am, it doesn't seem like there's that too daunting of a learning curve there for PKI knowledge. Thank you for the explanation there, Jack. The next question comes from Vaishnav. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Thank you for attending all of our AMA sessions today. Question for you, Jack. Can we migrate our on-prem CA server to Cloud PKI? And will the hybrid method also work in this method?
Yeah, so actually might be time to jump into a little bit more demo in the console. And I won't go through the end-to-end process, but I do want to show folks how you can use what we're calling BYOCA. So to directly answer the question, can you move your existing certificate authority to the cloud? No, can't do that. But what you can do is use your existing on-premise infrastructure to create a certificate authority in the cloud that's signed by that existing infrastructure. So if I click that I want to do an issuing CA, and I select bring your own CA, here, once I'm all done with creating the properties that I want, we'll do is create a certificate signing request, or CSR. I would take that CSR and bring it to my on-prem infrastructure and have that certificate authority signed by my existing on-prem infrastructure. We've really built a very clean roadmap for customers. It's commonly referred to as the brownfield migration, where I can use my existing infrastructure that I've spent the years building, but simply create my BYOCA and start deploying certificates from the cloud without having to build out all of that extra on-prem infrastructure associated with things like NDES and exposing your NDES server to the public internet, and how do I get connectivity for my devices to talk to that endpoint. So yeah, BYOCA is really the clean answer, and great question.
All right, thank you for the demo there. Another question that has come from the tech community page from Troy. The best practice was always to have an offline route to protect the private key. The question here is, how is the key protected / secured with Cloud PKI?
Yeah, so Troy's not wrong. There was a lot of guidance around having an offline route CA. A lot of that guidance came from years past, where there wasn't hardware security modules to protect keys, or if they were extremely expensive, and they still are today. The nice part about Cloud PKI, we are using HSM, or hardware security modules, to back the private keys. That is only for customers that pay for the service, because HSMs are expensive, even for Microsoft. It is a physical piece of hardware. You can read about it in the Azure HSM documentation. When I glanced at it, the cost for a customer to have their own Azure back to HSM is quite expensive. There's a commitment of how much Azure consumption they would have before they can even ask to have one. So we've backed Intune's Cloud PKI or Microsoft Cloud PKI with these HSMs, and customers get it as just part of having the subscription with Intune.
That's awesome. All right. Another question for you, Jack, that has come from the tech community page from Anton. So how does the Cloud PKI in Intune interact with an on-premise requirements for MPS for things like Wi-Fi and anything, etc.?
Yeah. So Cloud PKI, we've built the certificate authority infrastructure, and that's the part that we've built. NPS, for those that don't know, is the Windows Server solution that responds to the Radius protocol, which is the authentication protocol. Commonly, where Radius comes into play is things like a Wi-Fi infrastructure will be backed by a Radius server. That could be NPS, it could be a third-party product. To do that authentication. And so Anton's question is around how can I use Cloud PKI certificates for that authentication? It all comes down to how do you configure and get trusting of that certificate authority? It's as simple as taking the Root CA certificate and installing it in your on-prem Active Directory infrastructure, which NPS is based on Windows and Active Directory, and adding it to what's called the NTAuth store, which is a store used by Active Directory to say, okay, these are the certificate authority chains I'm going to trust for authentication. So you add that, and at that point, NPS is ready to accept those certificates. So that part's built and is there. Nothing new from Cloud PKI specifically, but we have tested this deployment and worked great for Wi-Fi, VPN, and other things or things customers are welcome to go use.
That sounds great. Okay, another question that has come up regarding the BYOCA. Can you use this with secure multi-purpose internet mail extension certs?
Well, I guess I don't understand. Oh, SMIME. Okay. Can you use it for SMIME? There's two types of SMIME. SMIME is in my opinion, a bit of an archaic method. But there's SMIME signing, which is I am stamping an email with my certificate so people can come back and check that I'm a valid, my certificate's valid and that's in use. Cloud PKI could definitely be used with SMIME signing. When people ask about SMIME, most of the time they're asking about SMIME encryption. And SMIME encryption is something a bit more unique in that every email that I send is encrypted with my certificate. And it's sent to a specific recipient. So, Cara, if I were sending you an SMIME encrypted email, you would have to be able to not only validate my certificate, but you would need to be able to decrypt that email. So all of the mails need to be encrypted with the same certificate. That is not something that we can do with Cloud PKI today. And the real challenge here is once I've encrypted that email, it's encrypted as a one-time thing and encapsulated with this encrypted blob of data, and I can only read it with the same certificate. So customers that are using SMIME today, there's no way for them to use Cloud PKI, which would be issuing new certificates, to then go and read those encrypted emails. So huge challenge. I don't think Cloud PKI is the right solution to solve for this. My own personal mission in life, I would love to see SMIME be something that people don't use anymore. That's a very hard thing for people to hear. There are organizations that are deeply rooted in SMIME, but there's so much better protection mechanisms in the world today that the customers really should be looking at, like Azure RMS, where the mail's encrypted, but now I can actually control what can be done with it later. So I think I digressed. I got us off of Cloud PKI, sorry, but good question.
All right, thank you for your answer there. So we have a related follow-up question that you kind of talked about, but could we use Cloud PKI to distribute SMIME certificate authorities automatically through Intune?
Yeah, the answer is no.
Yeah, okay. That's what I figured there.
Yep.
Okay. So another question for you, Jack. Can we specify the encryption type and the key length of the issued certs?
Yep. So this is goes back to the SCEP policy that we create to instruct devices to go get certificates. You can definitely just specify the key length there. The encryption type is going to be a little bit dependent on what the clients support, but yes.
And so I have a question about that. Is that something that we have documented in the Cloud PKI Microsoft Learn?
It's more so it's in the SCEP documentation, the SCEP policy documentation that there's nothing new there for Cloud PKI. That isn't the beauty of what we've built is Cloud PKI lets you replace your existing NDES and certificate issuing infrastructure and go to a very simple to build cloud certificate authority solution. But all of the other capabilities of Intune of how we tell devices to get certificates. It already existed, and we just made Cloud PKI to work with it.
That's great insight. Another question for you. So that came from Twitter. Can I get rid of all my on-prem certificate servers?
Oh, this one hurts my soul. I would love to have the answer to be yes. Today, no, I don't think there's a way for customers. It really depends on what is your use case and how you use certificates in your organization. So, if the only thing you need is to issue certificates to Intune managed endpoints, then the answer here is absolutely yes. Um, However, I'm rooted in reality. There are other places that customers are going to need certificates. Things like we talked about the NPS server, and NPS servers would have an SSL certificate that they send to devices so that the device trusts the server before the device would send its client auth certificate. Um, those are things we can't do in Cloud PKI today. We have built a roadmap that is one of the things we know customers need. You saw when I was going through the demo. Another one was uh, cl- um, code signing. So customers that have developers that need to sign applications that they need to build. Um, it's another need that we don't currently solve with Cloud PKI. We've heard the ask from customers. It is something that's on our roadmap. So until we get all of those capabilities built out, I don't see it practical that customers can get rid of their on-premise certificate authorities. And quite honestly, that is why we ended up building the BYOCA
Mhm.
solution, where I can easily integrate Cloud PKI with my existing on-premise PKI infrastructure, quickly use this to deploy certificates to managed devices, and use my on-premise infrastructure to issue certs to other things I need, web servers, code signing certificates, and the like.
Got it. So it kind of sounds like this is something that we're keeping in mind for customers, but not possible right now. Is that
Correct. Yep.
got it?
Yep.
Okay.
We're working towards it. I don't have any timelines to share, but it is definitely yeah. We've built a roadmap and we know there's needs there.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for your answer there. Another question. So a question that came up from Akash. Could Cloud PKI be used for setting up always on VPN? Is always on VPN still recommended by Microsoft?
I don't know that I have a good answer for this one. I don't I've not worked with Hours on VPN in years. So I don't know what the certificate requirements are there. I believe it could be. It really depends on what's the backend authentication service and what would be needed there. So I can't answer the question of whether or not always on VPN is a recommended solution or not. Sorry.
Mhm. Is this something that you think documentation might have somewhere within our Microsoft Learn
Yeah,
articles?
I mean, always on VPN's a Windows type solution, so there may be some hints there. I don't even have a good resource off the top of my head to send folks to, unfortunately. Sorry.
That's okay. I feel like whenever I have trouble with, understanding something, my go-to is always Microsoft Learn. All right. Our next question comes from JF from the Tech Community website. So I thought I read somewhere that Cloud PKI also supports servers.
Interesting.
How so if we don't enroll these servers in Intune? Could you help us understand
Yeah,
there?
I'd love to know what the source of this was, and where the information came out. We certainly have a roadmap that we do want to eventually support servers, and exactly what that's going to look like, and how it will be done, and what are the management needs of the servers, all yet to be figured out. And once we've got some product there, we'll certainly share that. But today, no, Intune is not ready to deploy certificates to servers.
Okay, got it. And that's something that you said we have on the roadmap for now.
Correct. Exactly.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect. Just a reminder to the audience that we have here, keep sharing and upvoting any ideas at the link here, ak.ms/Intune feedback. That's a great link there for any go-tos that you have. All right. Okay, so the next question for you, Jack. Would you recommend using PKCS or SCEP certificates once the Cloud PKI is being set up?
Great question. So there is only one option, and that's SCEP certificate. So SCP is a simple certificate enrollment protocol. It is a method where ultimately Intune is going to be sending down to a device, hey, you need to go get a certificate. Here's all of the details about the certificate you need to get, and here's where to go get it. And so that is what the Cloud PKI, what we've built with Cloud PKI is the endpoint for the device to go interact with and get that certificate enrollment. Alternatively, PKCS, some folks have traditionally referred to it as PFX, is an entirely different method. Depending on your perspective, some people see it as a little bit less secure, in that PKCS, you ultimately go get the certificate from a certificate authority and deliver the cert as a whole package to the device, hopefully encrypted. The Intune methodology of PKCS is absolutely encrypted, but it's a offline method almost, if you will, where um, you're getting the certificate from the authority and then delivering it as a full cert to the device. When I say may not be best security practice, the big difference with SCEP, I'm telling the device, hey, you need to go get a certificate, and this is where you go get it from. The first thing the device has to do is generate a private key, and generally devices, depending on their capabilities, but like Windows devices, you can say, hey, put the private key into your TPM, which is on a Windows device is a hardware backed module. It's a chip on the device. So putting that private key in there and just asking for it to be signed. So that's very different than this other method with PKCS, where I'm transporting this public private key of the cert around the network and delivering it to the device. So
All right.
great question though.
Thank you for your explanation there. The next question that we have here. So can we use the Cloud PKI Root to implement any on-prem issuing CA for legacy domain joined devices?
Thinking about this question. So we talked earlier about how we could use the Cloud PKI issued certs with NPS. So
Mhm.
I think it kind of depends on what's intended here by legacy domain joined devices, and what the use case is. Um, but yes, you can absolutely take the public key of the root CA and install it in your domain. Send that as a trusted root authority to your domain joined devices. You could do that with Intune with the trusted certificate policy. You could also do that with an Active Directory domain and group policy, where you distribute these certs to devices that you want to trust it. So if that's what's meant by the question, absolutely, you can do that. And there's no issues there. It's the issuing of actual client or end device certificates that we can only do to Intune managed devices today.
Thanks for your answer there. The next question comes from Mohammed. Is there a plan to introduce the ability to edit settings of a Cloud PKI CA, issuing CA once they are already created in Intune?
Oh my! So I'm gonna go back to one of your earlier questions of how much do I need to know about PKI before I start using Cloud PKI? This is part and parcel to understanding the certificate world. So once I create a certificate, that is a signed, created entity. I can't change that because it is something that's intended to be used in different places. Like we just talked about, I could download the root CA certificate and I could distribute it to all my Windows devices. That is a one-time operation. So once that certificate's created, that's it, it's done. So asking if I can edit the settings of my CA, you can't, because the only way to do that is we have to issue a new certificate authority cert, which is a new cert in and of itself. So you can certainly create multiple CAs with Cloud PKI, and have your different settings there. We do have some limits that we've implemented for customers, so you can create up to 6 certificate authorities, and that can be any combination. Ideally, kind of the way we thought about it is customers would create perhaps 2 root certificate authorities, each with 2 issuing certificate authorities, and that would get to 6. You could have 1 root and 5 issuing. You could have 3 roots with 3 issuing. So that's what we've got today. If customers get to that magic number of 6 and they need to clear something out, today they would need to go through our support organization to help get things deleted. We are looking at capabilities in the future where customers will have direct delete capabilities if they run into those kinds of challenges. We also really want to hear feedback from customers. Is 6 enough? Are there challenges and like real thought out engineered use cases where they need more? Not saying that we can make it be higher, but something I think we'd love to hear the feedback on.
Yeah, I noticed when you were going through the demo that once you created the CA, there was no option to edit it. There was like the message on top that tells customer, hey, I can't edit this. And you kind of answered my question on whether there's a workaround to edit. And that process is going through deleting the CA and then creating a new one. But it kind of sounds like we need to go through customers, we need to go through Microsoft support in order to do so.
For the delete, yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. So there is a workaround, but it doesn't seem like there's a way to directly edit for now. Another question from Michael. Are there any restrictions in using Cloud PKI with Windows MultiSessions? And can I use Cloud PKI to deliver my MSIX App Attach Certificates to my devices?
So the second part of that is talking about code signing, I believe, or the MSIX App Attached Certificates. In Cloud PKI doesn't do code signing today, so I think the clear answer on that is no. Curious about the Windows MultiSession. I don't see any reason why not. If this is something that you could do previously with NDES and SCEP profiles, there would be really no change with Microsoft Cloud PKI. So really depends on the use case. I haven't had that question before, so it's interesting. I'd love to learn more about it.
Yeah, and just for our audience right now, I just wanted to thank everyone for tuning in live today and posting questions. Just a reminder, you'll be able to view this AMA on demand after we conclude our session today, and you are welcome, very welcome, to continue posting your questions in our website through Friday. Another question for you, Jack, that came from the tech community website. Once the Cloud PKI is in place, do we need to have an app proxy inside the SCEP profile? And where would one retrieve the SCEP server URL to put in the SCEP config? So there's kind of two questions there.
Yeah, and maybe it's time to jump back to showing my screen here. So do you need an app proxy? No, that's the beauty of what we've built with Microsoft Cloud PKI, is we've taken that need and complexity away and built that into the product. So the question was, where do I get the SCEP URL? So this is one of the issuing CAs that I had built before, and you'll see that we've got a SCEP URL in there. I'll admit mine was from an early environment. Today, you'll see the first part of, if I can make my mouse move, you'll see the first part of this is replaced with a variable. It's like a Intune scale unit, or I can't remember the exact format of the URL, but that is the SCEP policy. We do have a copy button here. So when I click that, it's added to my cut and paste buffer of my machine that I'm doing it from. And that SCEP URL is what I will take and add in when I'm creating my SCEP policy and paste in there. So super simple to do that, and there's no extra infrastructure or app proxies or anything like that that customers need to build. We've just built this right into the solution with Microsoft Cloud PKI.
Thanks for answering that two-parted question. Just a reminder to the audience as well to tune into this URL that's moving on my screen. Ask us anything about Cloud PKI. We're here to answer anything for any questions that you have at aka.ms/ama/Cloud PKI/Intune Suite. It's a long URL there.
That's a mouthful.
Okay, so we have a comment that came from X. So this is going to make NDES servers obsolete, I hope. Jack, what are your thoughts about that?
Oh, I wish I had the name of the person here. I give them a pat on the back or a big hug. I don't know. When I started at Microsoft, one of the first things I had to help support was NDES, or Network Device Enrollment Service. It's a Windows role, and it is traditionally how what customers have had to build to use Intune to distribute certificates to devices. Third-party MDMs, many of them use an NDES server as well. And yes, whoever posted this, you're absolutely right. This is going to make them obsolete. We've gotten rid of all of the complexity that folks have had, because it wasn't just the NDES server part itself. Adding a role to Windows is relatively easy. It was more so all of the requirements to expose that certificate as a web server out to the public internet, so that my devices could come in. There's also challenges with, like, there's some certificates associated with that NDES role to do its job that don't auto renew, and they're good for, I believe, a year by default. It might have been 2 years, but very common that customers set up their NDES server and it works until those certificates expire, and nobody acknowledged that they expired, and then it stops working, and they're like, oh, now what do I do? Very painful support case. In fact, I know of a lot of customers that just didn't even know where to go and start troubleshooting that problem. And instead, they just be like, oh, let me create another NDES server and expose it. And that's a valid way to solve that problem, especially when you're in a critical moment and you kind of have an outage in your organization. So yeah, absolutely. I think we've built a solution to make NDES servers obsolete.
Thanks for your comment there. We have a question from LinkedIn. So Jack, are there any hierarchical limitations to moving our CAs to the cloud in Intune?
Okay. Interesting question. So the what I take from this is do how many certificate authorities can I have in my chain
Mhm.
for BYOCA? And we don't have any limitations there. The real requirement is that you create the BYOCA on the Intune side, um, and you have it signed by a certificate authority on-prem. That could be a root CA. It could be 3 or 4 levels deep. Um, really depends on what your infrastructure is, and what you plan to continue to support in your organization. So something we haven't talked extensively about today is certificate revocation and certificate revocation lists. So um, every certificate authority needs to be publishing a certificate revocation list, and so if I had a PKI infrastructure that, let's say it is 6 levels deep, and I sign my BYOCA at that 6th level deep CA, now I have to always continue to maintain all of those 6 certificate authorities in my on-prem infrastructure, if for nothing else than to keep that CRL current and signed.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
So another question that has come up from the tech community website from Cosmin. So what Azure services are currently integrated with Cloud PKI? And Jack, could you share a roadmap with us for any future integration with the rest of the services in Azure?
Um, it's interesting. So roadmap. I don't know that I have anything I can share. Um, I find it interesting. The question is what Azure services are currently integrated with Cloud PKI. Cloud PKI is certainly built on Azure services that Intune um, is we've built on top of. As far as being able to use Microsoft Cloud PKI certificates with other Azure services. Um, there are none, and I'm not aware of anything specific in the roadmap there. Would love to hear what people see as a potential use case and where we need to perhaps fill into that roadmap.
Yeah, that's interesting. A reminder for our audience, if you would like to see any insights into our future plans, you can check out the link aka.ms/intune and dev. Jack, I know we talked about revocation a little
Mhm.
bit. So a question came up about that. So does the revocation list have a public endpoint?
It does. In fact, the screen I was showing earlier had the CRL distribution point listed. That is a public CRL. As soon as you create your certificate authority, a CRL is published and is accessible via that public URL. And is part and parcel to another one of these things that has eased the use of certificates in this cloudy world that we live in now, where things need to interact. And that's another point of where customers really challenged with on-prem infrastructure is when I start looking at using certificates in a cloud world where my end users are, perhaps anywhere in the world on any type of internet connection. Of what do I do about my CRL endpoints and how do I also expose those. So Cloud PKI, absolutely, the URL is created and hosted by the service and is published and maintained by the service.
Thank you for your answer there. So will we be able to add the certificate authority to an Azure Key Vault and to be able to deploy certs to VMs, etc., for very easily and securely?
Got it. No, not today.
So,
Yeah,
okay.
and this kind of goes to your question earlier of um, we are can we deploy certificates to Azure services? So
Mhm.
um, I think this is one of the use cases we are looking at as a future thing. you could, if the VM is a Windows client machine that is Intune managed, you could certainly deploy a certificate to those. I think in this question, we're probably asking more about, Azure VMs that are a server type operating system, whether that be Windows or Linux or some other flavor, or even a service. That is something we are looking at. No timelines or details to share on when that might be something we do in the roadmap, but that is something we do have on the list.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. Not something we support today, but something that we're looking at and considering for in the future. So another question besides SCEP, are there any other supported protocols or planned supported protocols in the future?
Who planted all these roadmap questions in here for me? Um, I guess I can talk a little bit about where I see the industry's headed. I don't know when we'll have something like this in the roadmap, but the alternative to the SCEP protocol, which is an unratified standard, by the way, but everybody uses it. There is another standard out there called ACME, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for. Automatic Certificate Enrollment. ME. I can't remember what the ME stands for. I can tell you Apple on their iOS devices have already built a lot of support for ACME protocol. Is something that we know about and we're looking into. Equally, ACME is kind of, think of it as, at least in my mind, I think of it as SCEP v2, or the ratified standard on how do I do automatic enrollment for managed devices. So Acme is probably the direction we'll head and support, and we'll see exactly where that lands us in the end, and what type of endpoints. The Acme protocol will be something that has to be adopted by all the different endpoints. So we know Apple's got it today. But then questions come in as well, is it available for Android? Is it available for Mac OS? Is it available for Windows? And all of these other platforms. So we'll see. But my crystal ball says Acme is probably the future protocol we'll look at supporting as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your insight there. Um, if it's not something that directly have any timelines or anything for. Um, Another question for you, Jack. So from someone in the tech community website. So the question is, I think I have read that the revocation list was still a CRL and not OCSP. So any reasons that you can share why this option and not the other one?
I can share that as we looked at what customers do today, that CRL is by and far used by way more customers than OCSP. OCSP is so I'll back up and give people the basis behind the difference. So CRL is a certificate revocation list, and it is kind of what its name sounds. It's a file that I download that has a list of revoked certificates. It is a basis of almost any certificate authority of something that they would produce. The challenge with it is an entire list. OCSP instead is a web-based protocol that I can ask a server, hey, this certificate, is it valid? Has it been revoked? So it's an interactive protocol. It is something that we're looking to do, but it's not something that's necessarily supported by all of the different authentication endpoints that people would use. And we knew that CRL was something that has been around forever, and is widely used by many solutions today. So it was the core need of what we had to have. OCSP is something we do plan to add as a roadmap item. Again, no timelines that I can share. But and you saw when we did the demo that it was OCSP signing was one of the purposes that we have intended there. So that is a future-based thing, and it is why that purpose is listed there.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your insights there. So the last question for today's session, how should siloed groups within IT orgs handle this feature, Cloud PKI? Usually endpoint managers handle Intune features, but what about those orgs that handle PKI through their security departments? That's interesting.
Mm.
Is there a new entry role that can be delegated just for Cloud PKI?
Yeah, I think this is a good kind of eye-opening question, and I think we are kind of challenging these silos that exist in on-prem, or not on-prem, within organizations, where I think the questioner is right on point that yes, there are siloed groups, and generally certificates and certificate authorities was perhaps the security team, and Intune, being traditionally device management, was, an endpoint management team. Um, Great concept. We have built into Cloud PKI Intune's RBAC model. So if an organization is using Intune and RBAC capabilities, you can certainly restrict um, the admins that would have access to Cloud PKI versus maybe it's creating device management policies and things like that. As far as there being an additional Entra ID role, um, I don't we don't currently have one. I don't know that we've got really strong evidence that there would need to be another role created there. Is something we're actively listening to the feedback from um, our customers, and we'll evaluate if that need really exists.
Yeah, that's super interesting there. I I would say typically we hear from customers that Intune RBAC rules are sufficient enough for limiting certain types of actions to certain types of groups within a company. So it would be interesting to see if, like specifically for Cloud PKI, if this is not the case. So Jack, before we wrap up today's session, I just wanted to ask about your perspective and if you can share any insights that you have. So, what do you say to people who ask, is Cloud PKI just CA as a service, or is it more than that?
Oh, this is hard because I've lived with this and helped get it to where it is. It is a certificate authority in the cloud. I think our vision is that it will be more than that at some point. But at the end of the day, certificate authority is a certificate authority. But what we've done is built this very simple solution for a very complex problem. And that to me is really the key value of having worked with customers for so many years on how do they do the traditional NDES and get all of those things set up. And I know many customers that struggled going across their silos for months to get all of the requirements met. And technically it wasn't that hard. I could today I could bring up an NDES server in my own environment where I control everything within a day. But that is a day's worth of work. But then you talk about an enterprise where you do have all of those silos. You've got one team that manages the firewalls, and somebody else manages the certificate authorities, and got to spool up a virtual machine and these types of things. It it becomes complex, and some of that is that siloed IT infrastructure that makes it complex. But there are technical complexities as well. And the nice part is Cloud PKI, we've taken all that away. It's a couple clicks, and I can create a whole certificate authority infrastructure in minutes. I know some of the initial feedback we got from customers was, wow, I created my whole PKI in 5 minutes. And they must not have been going very quick. They must have been thinking about the answers that they put into the UI.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your feedback and insights there. So everyone, to our audience, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you so much, Jack, for answering everyone's questions. Just a reminder that we'll be continuing to answering questions in the chat through this Friday. And please visit aka.ms/intune/TCL to watch all of today's sessions on demand and post your questions about Intune there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cara. Great conversation today.